Perfect. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Landcare check-in for this month, where we'll be joined by Keighery and Kathryn Batchelor to discuss everybody's favourite topic, weeds. If you haven't seen my face before, my name's Eve. I'm the Member Services Manager here at the WA Landcare Network, and I just wanted to extend a welcome to Vanessa from the Wallen team, who's here with us today as well. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Wajak Noongar. However, today I'm calling in from Manang Budja down in Denmark. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend a deep respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders on the call today, and I acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, sea, and sky as the world's oldest continuous living culture. So please feel free to acknowledge what country you are on in the chat function. So today we'll be talking identification, management, technology, and Kathryn will also be walking us through some of the latest apps to help with your land care efforts. We will touch on dry and wetland weeds, agricultural and bushland weeds. There's bound to be something in this presentation that will answer a burning question that you have been able to have found the answer to. We'll also be discussing their upcoming publication of the 3rd edition of their Weed Bible, as it has been described to us, Western Weeds. The first edition of this guide was published in 1998, and the second edition was published in 2007. However, both are now sold out, but the Society is working on producing the 3rd edition to be published potentially at the end of next year, 2026. Very exciting. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who may need no introduction to some of you. Keighery, OAM, is retired as a Senior Principal Research Scientist in the Science and Conservation Division of the WA Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, as a botanist in the Biogeography program, which is largely responsible for regional scale surveys to establish conservation networks. Over the past 40 years, he has undertaken biological surveys through most of Western Australia, including the Goldfields, the Kimberley, Nullarbor, the Carnarvon Basin, the Swan Coastal Plain, and most major parks and reserves. Greg has authored and co-authored over 400 scientific papers and popular articles on the biology, phytogeography, ecology, and taxonomy of native and weedy plants of Western Australia. He has had a long-standing interest in naturalised plants, or weeds, and helps curate the weeds for the West Australian Herbarium, and has the largest number of native and naturalised plant specimens in the herbarium, and is a co-author of the Field Guide to Weeds of Western Australia, Western Weeds. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation, Greg. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Oops.
It's all right. Just give us a second to get it right.
No, you're all good. Take your time.
Just confirm that it works so we can
looks good.
See what we're doing.
Okay, so weeds of Western Australia. Weeds are essentially vascular plants, I think you need to remember, but we've also got a lot of invasive algae, mosses and fungi, and they are in many cases as problematic as the vascular plants, so they can occupy both the oceans and the land. Essentially, a weed's a plant growing where it's not wanted, and that's still about the best definition. And naturalised, which most people use fairly readily, really is something that's reproducing unaided by man. This causes a few problems in the sense that things like wheat probably isn't naturalised, but it's along every road verge. They don't actually establish or reproduce, but they're so commonly seen that they're generally listed as naturalised. Weeds affects areas, they're amenity, things like double Gs are basically an amenity weed. They can be agricultural, meaning they take away from crop yields, or more recently, they've become environmental weeds affecting the bushland of Australia and overseas. Most of our weeds are from overseas, so they're exotic plants to WA. Generally, 1788, the European settlement of Australia is regarded as being anything pre that is thought to be native. And if you look at WA, we've got about half of Australia's native plants, about 15,000 native species, over 8,000 in southern Western Australia, of which over 80% of those are only found in the state. Prior to 1788, new plants were added to Australia's flora by long-distance dispersal or the evolution, obviously, of new species. There are a couple of things that are listed as weeds, which certainly got here before 1788. They were recorded occasionally by Cook and Banks on the first trip, and they include things like the tamarind, which were planted by the Macassans when they came down to the Kimberley in the Northern Territory to get bêche de mer, and also the native gooseberry, Physalis, which is genetically has been shown to be a South American species. It probably came with the Spanish to the Philippines in 1600, and birds transferred it through Indonesia to Australia prior to Mr. Cook coming along and snacking on it in 1770. Naturalised weeds, worldwide, there's about somewhere over 18,000 flowering plants are naturalised against a total of about 250,000 known species of flowering plants in the world. Australia has about 26,000 cultivated species, although that's a bit old. It's about 10 years old, and it's probably considerably more than that now. And we have about 30,000 native species. So we have about the same numbers cultivated as native. This is not a cracker on Europe. The last catalogue in Europe showed they had approximately 70,000 planted species. So Australia, there's about 2,800 naturalised. And this also includes 600 some native species naturalised outside their native ranges. So not all weeds are exotics. They can be natives in the wrong place. In WA, currently, we have 1,336 naturalised, or at least about 2 days ago. So they consist of ferns, conifers, monocots and dicots, and 78 native species that are outside their known ranges. There are a lot of weed issues. One of the problems with weeds is there's an awful lot of them. And you'll get new and emerging crop and environmental weeds, and Kathryn will talk a bit about some of the aspects of how we work out what some of the new ones are. There are new issues emerging, which are congeneric plants being planted here with hybridization and genetic pollution. And there's also issues with GM, with the capacity of genes to escape from cultivated plants into the wild and into naturalised species and causing them to become resistant to herbicides. We've also got some pretty new players, and NRMs are one of those, but climate change obviously will affect weeds as much as natives. We're getting a lot of roadside plantings causing invasion of remnants in the Perth metropolitan area, and I'm sure that's probably an issue for you and many other people, that these plantings are not native species and they're allowing invasion to occur of some of our remnants. And there's some issues about what actually is a weed and what is a native. Just one example of a new weed that's been got rid of. This is Ornithogalium umbellatum. It's a wheat rust host. It was picked up in the Ravensthorpe area and it's since been eradicated. So species that have economic value tend to, of course, get more work done on them, and they tend to be ones that we try and eradicate if they turn up. But there are native ones as well. The arrows there, this is a South African bulb called Gisseriza aspera. It's a C1 species, meaning that in WA it's declared by the Department of Agriculture. It's prohibited to import it. It's prohibited to grow and sell it. We discovered this at Hamel in 2016. And you can note it there, it's growing with Babiana angustifolia. This was regarded by the Victorians as one of the most serious potential new weeds they had. And it's now an alert species for the Swan Coastal Plain in the southwest. It was growing in old forestry land and probably came out of the Forest Department nursery, but fortunately Deep Herd actually has mapped it all and has drowned the place in herbicides, and hopefully this environmental weed has been eradicated. One of the main issues that one always needs to keep in your forefront is biosecurity. Hopefully biosecurity will mean if we have proper biosecurity, we don't get any new weeds, we don't get any new pests, and we don't add to variation in the old pests we have. The aim of biosecurity is to enable commerce, horticulture and agriculture to thrive without causing problems to anybody else. We've got some pretty major issues with this in terms of trying to work out what people are bringing in. And this is just one example I picked up recently. This is supposed to be Rhodanthe manglesii. That's the photograph. On the back of the packet, it notes the seeds are in fact Rhodanthe chlorocephala subspecies rosea, which is a completely separate species to the one shown in the picture on the front. And this is not a trivial issue. We get a number of things where the plants are being imported under common names, or not even common names, but trade names, and they don't bear any resemblance to what's actually in the packet.
Where is this podcast from? What is it?
You okay? No.
All good, keep going.
Okay. So biosecurity, we have permitted and prohibited lists, both state and federal. Now, Western Australia has a thing called WOL, which is the WA organisms list, some 56,000 organisms on that, including 48,000 plants. They also have a list of what's present in WA, and those tend to be the ones you're allowed to bring in. And you'll notice there's 37,000 of those. There's about 4,000 absent and about 14,000 of things that we don't know quite what's going on as present. But this was done a long time ago based just on nursery lists, and it desperately needs updating, because to know what you don't want to have is a very important aspect of biosecurity. And just one example, this is Dolichondra ungus cattii, the cat's claw creeper. It's a C1 prohibited declared pest. It used to be Macfedenia ungus cattii. It is definitely in Western Australia, although if you look at that map from ALA, you'll notice there's one dot in the Kimberley in a garden. But it's definitely present, and it's definitely doing well in WA. And it's an example of something that's on the WOL list as being not present, but it actually is. Also, one of the issues is that it doesn't really cover any eastern state species. And recently, we are beginning to find more and more populations along the south coast of weedy Kunzias from eastern Australia, including Kunzia erycoides, and Kunzia, there were two of them, I just put one up. Kunzia affinis, which there is about 100 hectares of in one of the new properties the Gondwana Links bought at Cape Riche. These are not prohibited, they're allowed in. Kunzias, they're very weedy in their own areas. They hybridize with native species. In the areas they're invading, there are about 10 native Kunzias, some of which are quite rare, and this could be an example of genetic pollution. Another plant we don't want in the WA, this is in the Northern Territory and in South Australia, is Norandia procumbens, which is just another big burr species. And that, with the increasing travelling going through Central Australia, it's quite likely this will be picked up on tyres and brought into Western Australia, into many of the Aboriginal lands in Central Australia. Another example, Ludwigia perennis, only known from a few drains around the Perth airport. That green stuff there is it in the Harvey River. We recorded in 2023 when we went down to the Harvey River catchment for them to look at how they were going to do stuff with the Harvey River. A classic example, if you don't know what you've got, you can have some really major issues and not even know that they're there. And also, just for the hybridisation, pig faces. We have a range of native, poorly taxonomically known pig faces in Western Australia, but we also have the very weedy South African Carpobrotus edulis. The natives are dioecious, two separate sexes on each different sorts of plants. The weed isn't, so it can set seed by itself, and it hybridizes readily with the native species. And the hybrid is very vigorous from cuttings, and it's been planted extensively as a mistake for the native. We've also got things like these bulbs, Lacanalias, 150 species of these in South Africa, and increasing numbers of species of this genus found being a weed. Some of the other ones, things like mangroves. This is the button mangrove, found in Karratha. This fortunately got reported, and it is important that things get reported and documented, because the Karratha Shire, fortunately, the second author on this paper happens to be very friendly with the Shire president, and they are getting rid of the button mangrove, which is essentially something that would be a really good idea. And lastly, there are issues about what we think of as weedy and native. Saltwater cooch for there is definitely a weed in southern Western Australia, picked up in 1890, but it is native to the tropics. The batwing fern was thought to be a new record for the state as a native when picked up around Denmark, but it's definitely a weed, and it's spreading rapidly throughout much of southern Western Australia. And Typha orientalis is one of the ones which we've shifted from being a weed to a native. It was known to be a major food source for the Noongars and reported on from that in the 1830s. However, just being a native doesn't mean that it's good for places it's in. If you have a management plan and this is causing biodiversity effects, being a native does not stop you controlling this species. And that's a me. So that'll give you hopefully an idea of what some of the complexities are for weeds. They're not, unfortunately, a single issue and simple process.
Does anyone have any questions in the immediate for Greg? You want to put a hand up or on mic?
They're too depressed.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. All right, let's head over to Kathryn. I'm going to introduce our second speaker for today. Kathryn is a weed ecologist with CSIRO and is currently acting in the weeds program leader role at DBCA. Her experience is broad over the field of weed ecology, ranging from molecular ecology using eDNA to detect sparse weed species, spatial analytics to remote field survey and surveillance. Long associated with biological control research in Western Australia and was involved in delivering agents for bridal creeper and blackberry, her recent research has focused on eradication science and specifically what it takes to achieve eradication. She'll be presenting on the range of weed ID apps around and in use and how to determine which one to use in any given situation and where the data goes. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you much, Eve. Thank you for everyone for joining in on our talk. I just had one comment on Greg's talk when he had the map of where Cat's Claw Creeper is. There's now 4 dots down near the Perth region, but there's actually quite a few more records in addition to that. So I'd say sometime in the last decade, it's been sold in the nursery industry area because 3 of those records were hedges or like covering people's fences. So anyway, the nursery industry has a lot to answer for. So I'll just get hopefully I might, just give me a minute. I just have to open up the PowerPoint talk since Greg's is on.
Where does that cat's paw creeper originate from?
Probably South America.
Yeah, South America. So it's really serious weed in rainforest areas and creek lines, but in the hills it's in about a hectare of jarrah forest, doing very well.
Okay, all right, thank you. So using apps to ID weeds, and I think what's quite important is also what happens to your data. So like if you're going to all the effort to record or look for a plant and see if you could recognize it based on an app, it's also collecting some data from you while it's at it. I thought it is also say that I'm also currently the president of the Weed Society of Western Australia, which is a professional society that quite a number of people that work on weeds in this state belong to, which includes DPIRD, CSIRO and DBCA and some of the consultants. Okay, we've got a website. You can look us up if you're really keen. So, who cares about weeds? In my experience, not that many people really like weeds or they aren't particularly passionate about researching weeds. We've had a number of students come and see us over the years and they're more interested in learning more about banksias and orchids than learning to be about weeds. But weeds are extremely common in the landscape and to the point where people often think because they're so common, they must be native. People don't like to collect and report on weeds very often either, especially if it's growing in your garden or growing in agriculture. And these are also underrepresented in herbariums. And there can be, and part of that is because, it's not that particularly exciting collecting a herbarium specimen on a weed. It's much more exciting to send something native to the herbarium and get an ID. But there can also be a cost in submitting a specimen to a herbarium, as also from the effort of preparing a procedure, providing them with the data and then transferring it to Kensington or some of the regional herbariums. But I want to say that the WA Herbarium is still the absolute authority on identifying plant species in Western Australia. So if something has newly arrived in WA and it could be spreading like mad, but if there is not a herbarium specimen, it doesn't exist in WA. So the herbarium publishes the WA a list of naturalised plants, and that only relies on herbarium specimens. So if it isn't in the herbarium, it doesn't exist. So yeah, I would have to say the herbarium absolutely cares about weeds, and evidently landholders and conservationists care about weeds, and they would like more help in trying to tell whether a plant is native or not, especially at the time that they're currently doing weeding. So how do they get that timely information? So are apps the modern herbarium? I would like to kind of see that they are the modern herbarium, but I don't want to. There is, as I said before, a weed doesn't exist unless the herbarium gets to have a specimen as well. But there are also a range of apps and web services that you can use to ID plants and also report their location. But bear in mind that they're only going to be as good as the images you've taken, because you cannot identify, and there are going to be plants that you absolutely can't identify from photos because there's no smell or touch or feel, or you can't tell how many hairs there are on something. And some species really do require DNA to help them identify what subspecies they are and even species they are, especially if they're hybridizing. So there's going to be a limit of what you can tell from a photo. And also point out that some of the global herbariums are digitizing their collection. So the long-term future of herbariums are probably going to be something that's going to be reflective of how much it costs to keep it maintained, also the space that they take up and the conditions, because you can imagine over the years, herbarium specimens do take up a lot of space and they need to be kept nice and dry and cool. But I do think, like, for a lot of plants and particularly weeds, I do see apps as the new herbarium, particularly for people working on weeds where it doesn't matter if they're identified to subspecies level. So for the case of like Watsonia, it doesn't really matter what subspecies it is, it's still going to be Watsonia and you're still going to treat it the same way. And the case for a lot of our weeds, the whole genus or family is exotic to Australia, and there can be many more hybrids. And again, the herbarium might struggle to identify it without DNA support. So this sort of brings me to what I wanted to talk to you all about, and that is like using apps or web services to ID plants. And secondly, using apps to ID plants. And more importantly, while you're going to the effort of using the app to identify a plant, log a record and who gets that data and where does that data go. So I'll start with apps that can identify plants. Most of the apps that identify plants use AI to match your image with a massive library of plants in the background. AI is used to drive the image matching against a range of images, and some of these have been also identified by humans. I wouldn't say all of them have, but some of them have. So apps that use this technology where they're relying on an AI library in the background, one of them is PlantNet. WeedScan, that's an app that was produced by the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions, so that's Australian only. Seek by iNaturalist is an app separate to the iNaturalist app that acts like a weed ID app. And there's also iNaturalist who have an AI plant, I shouldn't just refer to weeds when I talk about this, plant or organism identification within the app. And there's also web services that can identify plants like Google Lens, or Google Search Image, where you can simply take a photo, depending on the type of phone you have. For mine, I can open the photo up in the gallery, share it with Google Search Image, and it will do its best to match it based on the library of images that are out there. So, but one like iNet, so Google Lens and PlantNet, they're all global, they're owned overseas, and they just use images. But iNaturalist actually uses something more than just the images. It uses your location. So iNaturalist is constantly teaching itself. So if you take a photo of something and it does its best to match it with an image, if it doesn't think that plant, or no one else has ever recorded that plant in that area, it may discount that particular species and choose something that's more common in the area. So locations can actually facilitate your ID. But I want to say that the ability to recognise plants is only ever going to be as good as what the AI library has to compare to. So this was just one I did in my office because I thought while I was writing this talk, That's the front cover of the Noxious Weeds of Australia textbook. It's quite a decent textbook, and that's artichoke thistle on the front. So when I put that image into Weed Scan, it was the second choice of plants that of the idea. I can't read Hudson pear for some reason. I thought was its first choice. PlantNet identified it okay. Seek didn't actually identify it at all. But that may well be because artichoke thistle is not in WA, so it didn't match it up with location. But then it might not have. I think Seek or iNaturalist being a separate app may be one of these things that they're not actually resourcing very well. But what about something a little bit more non-mainstream, like not an agricultural related to agriculture? So this is an agave taken out in the garden bed at DBCA in Kensington. Weed Scan could not match it at all. It identified its best guess of this plant was June onion weed, whereas PlantNet and Google search image identified it as agave angustifolia, I think. I can't read from my little small text here. And there is a reason why Weed Scan couldn't pick that up. So in my opinion, like the best apps for weed, and so for plant IDs, particularly weeds, I would really just use PlantNet or Google search image to find it. So iNaturalist is good for the observations within the app. So rather than using Seek by iNaturalist, which is a separate app, I would use the image search within the iNaturalist app to help you find the plant. There's also some other apps out there called Plant Scan, Plant Snap, Picture This. Some of those paid subscriptions, some of them have ads within it. So yeah, I would definitely have a crack with iNaturalist as my preferred image one as well, because it records the location to help you suggest in a taxonomy. So iNaturalist is constantly learning itself. But the reason Weed Scan couldn't pick up that second app, second image, is because it only has an AI library of 500 species. So Weed Scan, being produced by the Centre for Invasive Species Solution, was a collaboration between CSIRO and a whole heap of state government agencies to prioritise 500 species for detection. But it also, another feature of Weed Scan was that if someone went out and took a photo and identified one of those 500 species, it would then send an alert or a biosecurity alert to the local weed officer or biosecurity officer. However, the unfortunate thing with Weed Scan, or actually the unfortunate thing with Western Australia, is DPIRD in WA did not participate in the development of Weed Scan because they actually they have invested their time in the My Pest Guide app instead. So Weed Scan is only as good as the 500 species in its AI library, and the biosecurity alert is actually not going to anyone in Western Australia. So I would say probably don't use Weed Scan if you're in WA. However, Weed Scan 2.2 is due for release sometime next year and has more species added to its AI library. So again, if you're moving over east, consider using Weed Scan, but it's still only going to be as good as the number of species they have. DPIRD's My Pest Guide is another app to identify weeds. It's also to identify pests, etc. as well, but it has people that do the identification, not AI, so the result isn't going to be instant. Usually when I log something into My Pest Guide, I usually get a report response sometime over a week or the week after, and they are pretty good at getting you a good identification, or they'll ask you to get some more images. But if I really want results immediately, and I'm not 100% sure about what the PlantNet app was going to tell me, I personally think, in my experience, the fastest way to get a convincing ID of it's a weed in WA is to use the Weeds of Western Australia Facebook page. There's a community of over 6,000 people on Weeds of Western Australia, and there are some very good, very passionate weedos on that site. And if you're in your garden and you are looking at a plant and you're not sure whether it's a weed, take a photo, join the Weeds of Western Australia Facebook page, and I think you'll probably get an answer within about 5 minutes. It's a very active group. So one of the words of cautions that I'll have with using some of these apps is that you're going to come up with a whole heap of different names for things, especially with the overseas apps. Like iNaturalist came from Cornell University. PlantNet, I have no idea where it comes from, but they use a different taxonomy in the background to what Australian apps would use. So for Australia, The Australian Plant Census, or in WA, the WA Plant Census, determine the correct taxonomic name for things. So the apps, for example, iNaturalist and PlantNet, they use Kew's Plants of the World online for their taxonomic background. WeedScan uses the Australian Plant Census, and I really don't know what Google Lens uses. It could be a possible mix. So there will be some differences in taxonomy, and there will be a lot of differences in common name because it reflects what's in global databases. So they're not going to have the common name associated with a species is not necessarily going to be what we in Australia know it as. So for example, Patterson's curse that we widely know, Echium plantagineum, is known as purple viper's bug loss in iNaturalist. If you don't know your species names associated with your common names, you could get quite a little bit unstuck. So I don't know if anyone in Australia would identify Patterson's or Echium plantagineum as purple viper's bulk loss if that was the first response it would get. And we also have some taxonomy issues as well, where the Australian, where it's known as a different species, genus and species name in Australia versus overseas, and that's simply because international herbariums may have adopted species revisions before Australians ones have. So, for example, Cape daisy or Velt daisy is known as Osteospermum ecolonius in the Australian Plant Census, but it's known as Dimorphotheca ecolonius in the Plants of the World online. Similarly, with Guildford grass, it's known as rosy sand crocus in iNaturalist. So that happens. So yeah, there can be some confusions happening, but if you know your common names and you know your native, your genus species names, it shouldn't be a big deal. So I wanted to point out, so with an app, you can do more than just identify plants. So they can do two things. And I want to bear in mind that most of these apps require you to log in and create a user profile before you start using their services for free. And you're actually giving them quite a bit of data. So you're giving them an idea of who you are through your username. You're telling it where you are through your location settings. You're telling it that you're at this location on this date, the plant, and you're giving it some information on the types of things that you like to collect, and particularly if you give it information in the note fields. You also, giving them, and I think this is some of the things, if you give them an idea of what you're the habit of collecting, you'll start feeding them they'll get more information about your profile. So PlantNet and iNaturalist share their data with open observation databases like the Atlas of Living Australia and GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facilities. They are global data sets that share biological data with each other. All the herbariums share their data with the Atlas of Living Australia and GBIF. And once a species is verified in both PlantNet and iNaturalist, the data is shared with those two facilities. WeedScan and My Pest Guide don't share their data with public databases. You can request data from them for research purposes, but generally you can't just get it just for curiosity reasons. This is why I'm not a particular fan of My Pest Guide. I'm a big fan of open sharing of data, especially pest data from a research point of view, because people may log records of weed species in My Pest Guide, but again, if it's not shared with the herbarium, no one knows about it. So open sources data enable people to find things and discover more about biodiversity in the area. So, and if I was looking for a large amount of data to do some species modelling, I would go to the Atlas of Living Australia and download what's there. I wouldn't necessarily occur to me to go to My Pest Guide and ask them for any data that they have there. And WA, by not sharing their data with these global databases, do themselves a disservice. So we have people in Canberra making decisions on where to spend our biosecurity money and looking at the map of Australia and seeing WA rather weed-free. So sharing of data will open up all sorts of positive opportunities for research, etc. So I was just going to go final up with what do I recommend and what I would encourage everyone to use for collecting data. So I'm going to say iNaturalist at the moment. It is actually an excellent app for recording natural sightings. And what I like about it is that the record becomes a public record on the Atlas of Living Australia after verification. So naturally, the ability to verify your image is going to, or your record is going to be a function of how good your image is, and also the complexity of species, because bear in mind, some of these things can only be identified down to genus. So I do use it for weeds, and in this way, it is for me the modern herbarium, because it's the easiest and quickest way to lodge a specimen or a record so that someone can find it again. And I'm not always going to be in the sort of convenience of having my herbarium sheets with me where I can put it in and spend time writing notes. I also wanted to point out there are some other apps that are there for collecting biological data. There's Nature Mapper. That was a product of a group in Canberra that expanded it Australia-wide, but it's no longer being resourced, so it's winding up next year. So if you have been collecting data through Nature Mapper, you can export your data from Nature Mapper straight to the Atlas of Living Australia, and possibly also import it into iNaturalist under your account. My Weed Watcher was an early app in DPIRD that was then absorbed by My Pest Guide. The data from My Weed Watcher just became part of My Pest Guide. And the Atlas of Living Australia has BioCollect for specific projects, but I also think they're going to stop resourcing that in the near future as well. And that's the problem with apps. They're expensive to maintain. You can spend, to keep an app going, a very basic app going, you need somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 a year just to keep upgrading that app with the latest iOS and software versions on your phone. They can be well over a couple $100,000 to make in the first instance. So creating an app, lots of people get money to create the app. It's a different kettle of fish to keep it maintained ongoing, especially if you're not quite happy with the amount of data you're getting out of it. So I'll quickly go over the next few slides. If you haven't got experience with iNaturalist, and this is simply how to use iNaturalist to log in or to log a record. So when you install the app on your phone, I'm not quite sure whether you have to go to the desktop to create your account. You can probably do it through the phone as well. But when you open up the app, you'll see one of these two screens. One will be a whole heap of tiles that show images of things around your area, or you can flip to map view. So when iNaturalist first came around, this map of Perth wasn't nearly as orange. There was all these white patches where there wasn't enough data, but so many people are using iNaturalist now. So it just gives you an idea of just how many people are actively recording records. So this, when you want to start collecting records or have a look, you can just click these three lines in the left and up will come what you can do. This is a simple DBCA weeds project that I have. So to add a new observation, there's on the bottom of that menu, there's a plus in a circle. Just select that to add a new observation. And the first thing it'll do is ask you to either upload a photo, choose an image. It also can record sound. So if you're recording birds or something, you can actually share your microphone with the app and take a recording of sound to log with the record and a photo. You can also choose not to load up anything. So for example, with this one, I've taken a photo of this purple bulb that's all over the place up not far from where I live. In the very first option, so it'll give it a few minutes to register that after you've uploaded the photo, it will come up with a suggestion for you of what this plant could be. So on the bottom of there, it's come up with 4 different suggestions. They're all, the top 3 are Babianas. It's the top one on this one, Babiana, and I can't read it, Angustifolia. Select that, and you notice that the common name is baboon flower, because that's what Babiana angustifolia is known as in South Africa, where it's native. So you can record some notes. You could just say something about the location. You found it while you're bushwalking along a track. It will automatically record its location as long as it gets some sort of cellular connection. You can also record if it's in a garden or if it's captive or cultivated. So with cultivated records or ones in your garden, if you select that box, it actually won't share your record up with the Atlas of Living Australia, because that's all about, iNaturalist is about collecting stuff in nature, not in gardens, but it will still keep that record on your account. You can also add it to projects if you can have a look when you go into iNaturalist, all the different projects from an area. There's often biosecurity blitzes as part of iNaturalist or species blitzes. There's always lots of projects going on. So after you've logged your observation, you'll see when you look at the actual record again, it has this needs ID as part of its data quality. So you need a second person to verify that observation before that data is shared. So, for example, Hills Flora is always on iNaturalist, recognising all sorts of records of the hills. So she was on there really quickly and agreed with me that, yes, it is baboon flower. And then it becomes what they consider a research grade observation. And once it's research grade, it will be shared with the Atlas of Living Australia. And it takes about a week or 2 weeks before that record will turn up there. But if Hills Flora, for example, didn't agree with me, they might come up with a suggestion or nothing, or add a comment. And if a third person is then required to confirm the record, and so forth, until everyone is a consensus that that's what that species is. So I wanted to say you can adjust iNaturalist to local settings. So I only did find this out the other day. So under settings, if you don't want to see baboon flower as the common name, you can adjust the common names from global to Australia, or for where it's got global, Australian common names. Change common names place from global to Australia. Unfortunately with that, even though it does suggest that it's going to show you a whole heap of Australian names, in most cases they're blank. They don't actually have an Australian name linked to the species, but it's still better than having baboon flower, in my opinion. And also the default license, unless you change it, is CCO, which is for public domain. So that means any record you log, that means anyone can use your image and share your image, but you can adjust that if you want. As I said, it can take a couple of weeks for your record to turn up on the Atlas of Living Australia because I don't know why, it's not quite instant, but there is a feed that goes up. So, and you can create projects. So if you want to have a sort of your friends of group wants to record, for example, species just within their sort of park area, you can actually set up a friends of such and such reserve and have your volunteers record records. And you can also create umbrella projects so that, like, for example, if DBCA wanted to have, like the Swan region wanted to record weeds in all their different parks, they could have Swan region as an umbrella project with all their parks as collections underneath. And you also, if you do have the option of not making your record public. So on there, when you log the record, there's a feature that says data visibility or location visibility. You can open that and you can turn it to open, which means that's the default. Obscured means they kind of, your record will be the observation still will be shared with the Atlas of Living Australian, but the actual preciseness of that lat and long will be obscured to be the centroid of a sort of a grid area instead of the actual location. So it's probably not such a bad idea for more sort of rare species, or you can also keep it private, which means that the location services won't be shared at all. I don't know if that means the whole record doesn't get shared, but definitely the location. And you can edit that later too if you change your mind. So yeah, and I suppose that sort of comes towards the end, and just bear in mind that lots of research organisations are using ALA to do species research. So when these observations get shared with the ALA, the type of observation is considered, it's classified as a human observation. So if you only want to look at the use verified records, which is identity confirmed by a botanist or an anthropologist or whatever data you're downloading, you can select to download from the ALA preserved specimens only. And that will just give you the preserved specimens. But if you choose all records, which includes human observations and preserved specimens, you get everything. And for weeds, I'm actually pretty happy taking the human observations because weeds are very common. And to really understand where weeds are and how much weeds there are, how dense weeds are in the region, you really can benefit from having human observations because that's, sometimes weed control data can actually populate a lot of dots up on Atlas Living Australia. So yeah, I encourage everyone to get out there and start logging your observations, particularly weeds. And that's it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Kathryn.
Yes.
Very,
Sorry,
very
I'm going to stop
interesting.
sharing.
Yeah, good idea. I've got a question for you. Do you know the My Pest Guide app? In terms of how that other weed scan app sends an alert to a DPIRD or like a biosecurity officer, does My Pest Guide do that for WA, or do we have any kind of service like that in WA?
No, so my Pest Guide belongs to DPIRD. So if you log a record direct into the My Pest Guide app, it goes to PADIS, which is the Pests and Diseases Information Service, and someone will identify it there. And if it's a species that they're particularly concerned about, they might send someone out there to napalm it, or they might just go, thank you, and just it's not a priority species at the moment. For the Atlas of Living Australia, you can actually set up biosecurity alerts, and which is what I want to do for all our parks next year, to set up an alert for species that are either observed by a member of the public in the park or just outside the park, so they know what's coming. I'm particularly interested in doing this for the Kimberley, for species that are just sitting in the Northern Territory border that haven't, as far as we know, crossed over into WA. So then DBCA staff can make a value judgment whether to push it further away from the WA border or not. It's up to them, I suppose. So that's something that the ALA has. And I do know DPIRD gets biosecurity alerts from the ALA for things like myrtle rust. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of what else they get a biosecurity alert for.
And where do you see some key kind of bottlenecks occurring, like say, for example, with specimens not being recognised by the herbarium? Like that seems like such a key issue.
Well, the herbarium will identify any.
Oh, I've dropped out for a second there. Hopefully that just comes back. Yeah, I'll just give them the text.
Oh. So yeah, we don't know why.
All right, I've just resumed the recording. We actually have a question about seed provenance from Clive here.
Yeah, so I was interested in everlasting, so I'm trying to get them to grow, but the slugs beat me to it. I think the advice was not to buy Mrs. Fothergill's seed packets because they're sort of not native. So what should I buy?
One of the issues with, if you're trying to do revegetation, one of the simplest methods of saying you should use local provenance is the fact that the further away you get from where you are, the more chance there is of a taxonomic fouler.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about the fact that if you're trying to do something about bushland restoration, local provenance will mean you've got the thing that you already had there. We've got, I would imagine, dozens of examples where people have ordered material from a fair way away and got totally the wrong species.
Yeah.
Our department, my old department, did it. They ordered Casuarina obesa, which was considered to go right across Australia. They got a thing which they now call Casuarina glauca, which has become a dreadful weed. If they'd got the seed from the Swan River, they would have got Casuarina obesa and never had the problem.
Right.
I always recommend to people doing any sort of revegetation work is keep the seed local, because the chances you're making a mistake are much smaller. And that seems to be the law of taxonomic remoteness. The further away you are, I can give you another example. At Rottnest, they've planted Olearia axillaris all around the development zone, and it's completely the wrong form. They got the seed from the mainland, and it doesn't match the local one at all. So even where the things are called the same species, you can still, and one must always be careful. The taxonomy of our native plants is still very much in the 19th century. We've got at least 10% of our flora is unnamed, which means somewhere about 1,000 species are still unnamed in the southwest. So it's just precautionary principle. If you're revegetating, use stuff from the local area and you've got much less chance of having a muck up. And same with importing it. Most importers want to use what they call trade names. I had one example last year where somebody brought in a truckload of chamomile, or a container load of chamomile for their wedding. They had a Pattis, the biosecurity people picked up a funny looking aphid on it. They sent me the material. None of it was chamomile. 5 different species in there, not one of which was a chamomile. They'd filled the order from Victoria with stuff from New Zealand because they didn't have enough material. So all of that got burnt. So somebody had a very unhappy wedding. And that's because you need to make sure the names are correct. Mucking up the names is not trivial. It can be a major issue. So it is important that we do try to keep names done properly. But generally, for weed apps within the stuff, it's fine. You'll actually find people do know the plants and do know them. It's the natives that are perhaps more of a problem with their taxonomy.
Quick question for Kathryn. This is being recorded. Where do I pick up the recording?
I'll send it out to you.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, because I'll forward on to Joy.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing that.
Okay, thank you.
No worries at all. Kathryn and Katrina from LCC.
Hi, it's Katrina here from Legionella Catchment Council. I have a question for possibly Kathryn, but maybe Greg. When you do your flora returns as per your DVCA flora collecting licence, and that gets sent through to DVCA, what is the turnaround time, do you know, between DVCA receiving that information and it actually going on to Florabase?
If they're specimen based or they're record based, they're quite different, because in the past, if they were herbarium specimens, they would have been added to Florabase. If they were observations, they would have probably gone on to DEFL. And so it's completely different. There were 2 completely different streams. And DEFL was a bit of a closed.
So DEFL might be something that's going to go on to bio. So I don't know if DVCA have it's called DandJu, which I don't know if you know it. You know it?
Yeah.
There may be was it DEFL data set? So when you can go, one of the search options on DandJu. Now, I'm not a big fan of DandJu. I'm still struggling to know about why it exists. But anyway, there is a bottom, one of the search things is data sets. You can possibly put a couple of keywords in there and it will show up all the data sets relevant to that it catalogues in DandJu. But yeah, if it has to be a physical specimen for it to turn up on Florabase. And I don't know if this is still true, but once there's a delay between putting your specimen in, it getting identified, and then it turning up on Florabase as data. And I do know at one point, sometime in the last few years, it was about a 2-year delay. I don't know if that's still the case.
It is, because they knocked down the old herbarium and built a new herbarium. They decided that they would not take any more material for the period when the old herbarium ceased operating and the new one up and running. Instead of 6 months delay, it was a 2.5-year delay. So there is a very large backlog of material to come through. And it is one of those things about assumptions about how long something's going to take and the reality of how long it actually took. And so there is a very large backlog in the current Kieran McNamara building in the vaults of material waiting to be databased and put into the collections and mounted. So, yep, there's quite a wait. Could be quite a wait.
I guess the reason for my question is because I know some, local shires or people in our area rely quite heavily on flora base for, you know, what is and isn't present in a location. And I'm just wondering, is ALA then probably the better place to find that correct information, or is it Dandew?
I would say, in my opinion, the ALA. So Dandew doesn't share data with the ALA. It's a large conversation that's happening in DBCA, so I don't think it's going to be forever that way. There are some data sets that are on Dandew that are also on the ALA, but for completeness, I would aim for for plants especially, I would go with the ALA. If I'm still employed with CSIRO. I still do species modelling with CSIRO, or I was doing it, and I didn't even know Dandew existed actually up until about 6 months ago. But I would still download all my specimen records to do all my work from the ALA. And I would use human observations for certain species and only preserve specimens really for native species. But then it just depends on what it is. The whole conversation about data sharing is evolving. I don't know whether I'll ever get DPIRD to open up their My Pest Guide data and share it. I would like to be able to at least get all the records in my Weed Watcher on DBC Estate at least shared with DBCA so we can understand what the public have been logging in. But yeah, there's a lot more, and yeah, I don't see any harm in sharing weed data because it actually helps everyone make sensible decisions on what is actually a priority and what's an alert and what we should be doing our work on.
Thank you.
The conversations are still going. There's plenty of people in DBCA that want to go to open sharing.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
So if you want to get in touch with us again, you can contact us through the Weed Society. So we have a website, there's a contact form in there. We're having our annual general meeting in about 3 weeks. So we all just talk about weeds. And if this is something that you love doing, just talking about weeds, don't hesitate to join the Weed Society and just engage the conversation, because it's literally all we do is talk about weeds. I don't know if it's a sad indictment on our personal lives, but
I talk about natives quite a lot too.
I just talk about weeds.
The other thing that you can get, and hopefully Dandew was meant to do, was to do site observations, because we've got some very large databases in DBCA that are from the biological survey section, which are point-based records.
Dandew is only about points.
Yeah.
It doesn't do polygons. So both ALA and Dandew are point data sets. They're not polygon data sets. And there's no plans for either in the near future to embrace polygon data. Kind of sucks, actually.
And do you think the benefit of that is being able to show distribution and range when you actually have polygon data?
Well, one of the issues is that we do have a lot of data on site records on what's in national parks and reserves and what are in sites, and they theoretically, if you could do the polygons, you should be able to find all of that data within it, because it is actually all recorded. It's a matter of finding it rather than, and it's not as simple as it should be. So if you did a search on Bustleton area, you would not necessarily find the 300 or 400 Swan Coastal Plain sites that have been set up right through the area, or the fact we've got species lists for most of the reserves. That's actually within the library system here, and you can ask the DBCA library and they may be able to find it, but it doesn't seem to be immediately apparent through the other public databases, which you would hope it would be.
So there is data sets on Dandew that may well be polygon data, where the data, rather than display it as a polygon, the data is attributed to the centroid of the polygon. So it may appear as point data, but if you, in the background, the data set, you can download that direct to QGIS or ARC if you wish, and you may actually see it display as a polygon. You'd have to have a look and see, because the idea of it, you're the idea of Danju is to be able to record whole data sets with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that that data set is shown in the Danju app, but the data set is still logged as a spatial file. I must admit, I haven't actually gone shopping to see what data is sitting up there. But yeah, since I've been at DBCA, I've been hoovering up all sorts of weed data from all over the place, just so that we can get a vision of just how much weed threat is sitting just outside DBCA reserves. So, but I haven't been, and actually there's surprisingly a good amount of data on weeds on Danju.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, who knew?
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Kathryn and Greg. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us today. So any links and resources, as well as a copy of the recording, will be provided to you via email in a few days' time. And if you're not already a member of the WA Landcare Network, we'd love to have you. And we'll also be sending out a super short survey, which will give you the opportunity to provide us with feedback on today's session and whether you'd like to see more on this topic. Yeah, keep an eye on our socials and for emails for updates for our upcoming events. And thank you everyone for coming. Have a lovely week.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great day.
Thanks, guys.